The financial ties between them, or I should use the proper grammar, the financial ties among them are weak at best. Capital markets in some countries are still strongly controlled with capital controls and domestic regulations. And those that are open, their ties are mainly with the outside world, not with other regional partners. There is some evidence, of course, of closer economic integration in the area, but it's not in the area of finance. It's in the area of trade. We know that the region has the amount of intra-regional trade within the region, both in absolute amount and relative to total trade, has increased enormously over the last decade or so. As a result of the growth of value chains, production networks, these have grown up. Initially, these were Japanese corporations or Western corporations coming into the area to take advantage of inexpensive labor or other features locally. But they have since been added to by local multinationals, not just Japanese, but Korean or others. And then, of course, East Asia is famous for ethnic groups, the so-called invisible linkages that have been created by ethnic business networks, particularly the overseas Chinese or the Koreans. The result is that there has been a very substantial increase in the importance of intra-regional trade. I have some numbers here that if you look at the ASEAN plus 3 countries. Now, ASEAN is, of course, the 10 countries of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. You add the plus 3 countries, China, Japan, Korea, and over the total time period from 1980 to 2007, the percentage of trade, which is intra-regional, has risen from 30% to 40%. If you add Hong Kong and Taiwan, the figures go from 37 to 55%, which is to say more than half of total trade is within the region as a result of the growth of these production networks and value chains. And these, in turn, have led at least some economists to conclude that the economic barriers are not overwhelming. Economic impediments are not necessarily a hindrance. There have been tons of studies using one or more of the criteria of optimum currency area theory. Tom and I were just having a little conversation about this, and it is true that the literature is very diverse in the conclusions that it comes to, but there does seem to be little doubt that there is some basis for closer monetary cooperation and financial cooperation in the region, if not across the whole ASEAN plus 3, among some subgroups within that. Or to put it differently, it does seem that the degree of heterogeneity in economic terms within the region is not all that different from the degree of heterogeneity that characterized the original Eurozone countries when the Euro came into existence at the end of the 1990s. If you think about the 11 countries, now grown to 16, that form the Eurozone, the degree of heterogeneity among them is much greater than many Europeans expected. Many had hoped that the Euro would start with a much more a core group that clearly was closer to the criteria of optimum currency area theory. But if we take that group of 11, there doesn't seem to be all that much difference between their situation then and the situation of East Asia now, which suggests that, if you will, it suggests that economics doesn't really seem to be the explanation why there hasn't been a more accelerated movement toward closer monetary and financial cooperation than there has been up to this point. And so my analysis shifts to the role of politics. What's the problem? I suggest politics is the problem. This is, not terribly original, and I won't claim to be swimming upstream against a great tide of opposition, but it is clear that what we have here is a situation in which there has been a lack of political will. Political will by itself doesn't mean anything. Political will is a reflection of more important underlying political conditions. What we have as a problem here is the achievement of what is sometimes called a sovereignty bargaining. That is to say, if we are going to really seriously, if a group of countries is going to seriously consider closer monetary and financial links, what's involved necessarily is some form of pooling of sovereignty, which is to say, accepting a commitment that might at some point turn out to be inconvenient. The old time inconsistency problem. Governments are very loath to do this sort of thing under most circumstances. It's no surprise that if we look around the world, following the formation of the Eurozone, and there were many discussions going on around the world about imitating the euro and creating monetary unions elsewhere in the world. It's no accident that 11 years after the introduction of the euro, and 2 decades since the Maastricht Treaty, that there hasn't been a single other common currency created. There's been a lot of talk about it. The Canadians talked a lot about monetary union with the United States. They even had a name for it. They wanted to call it the Amero. In Africa, people in the African Union wanted to have a common currency for Africa, and inevitably they wanted to call it the Afro. In Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, and the Mercosur countries, there was serious discussion at one point in the late 90s about forming a common currency. I asked them so when I was invited down to talk about this, I asked them, well, what would you call it? And they said, well, one of the few words we have in common in Portuguese and Spanish is the word gaucho. So they were going to call their currency the gaucho, which my students at UCSB thought was very amusing because the sports teams there are known as the gauchos. But with the possible exception of the Gulf Cooperation Council, where 4 countries do seem to be on the brink of creating a common currency, with that one exception, we haven't seen any invitations. And the reason seems to be clear. The reason is that it is difficult to persuade governments, difficult to create incentives for governments to accept the constraint on their sovereignty that is involved in a sovereignty bargain, to accept a commitment that could turn out to be inconvenient in the future. What would make them persuade them to do that? What would persuade governments to enter into a sovereignty bargain? In previous work that I have done on the sustainability of monetary unions, I came to the conclusion that one of these 2 conditions, or preferably both, are essential for the sustainability of a monetary union. They apply equally, I believe, to the initial incentive to create a monetary union or some form of monetary or financial cooperation. Either or both. First of all, needs leadership. Leadership. A powerful state or a small group of powerful states prepared to use their power positively or negatively, that is to say through sanctions or side payments, through carrots and sticks, to create an incentive for governments to to enter into a sovereignty bargain. Clearly, in the case of Europe, the historical reconciliation between Germany and France was critical.